Welcome back to Anno 1800. I'm Verso, and let's just get started. So, one of the things that I like to do with these videos is attempt to answer frequently asked questions, and I've seen a lot of them from new players, which, by the way, was me until recently, about the basics of production chains in Anno 1800. So, there's no shame in that at all, because really they're not quite as straightforward as they seem. And to be honest with you, I don't even think they seem very straightforward. For the record, expect Production Chains 101 here, not an advanced course, which I probably wouldn't be qualified to teach anyway. So at the outset, I do kind of want to pat Blue Byte on the collective back for their care with which they designed the production chains in Anno 1800. With that said, I've got to tell you that personally, I find them massively intimidating. This is really mostly owing to the web of dependencies that flow into a final product, especially as you progress through the game. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but let's just start with something extremely simple like work clothes, which sends wool from a sheep farm to a framework knitter building. So if you hover over each step in the process, what we can see is that both the sheep farm and the framework knitter have a 30-second production cycle. And just to define this, in Anno 1800, a production cycle is essentially the amount of time required to produce 1 ton of a given item. So it's important to realize that you always feed exactly one of any required component into the next step in the chain. So you would never have to feed, for example, 2 tons of wool into the production cycle of a framework knitter. Even in more complex chains that require multiple components funneling into a single output, it's always just one of each component thing going into a cycle and then one of the product thing coming out. So with work clothes, nothing gets lost in the process. 1 ton of wool becomes 1 ton of work clothes, so every 30 seconds. And just note that wool from the farm does have to be carted to the knitters, and you can occasionally run into some distribution bottlenecks, but we're keeping things simple for now, so enough said. It's worth mentioning here that the entire build menu is configured around these production chains. So, in other words, you don't see a sheep farm anywhere on this bar, right? And there's a reason for that, because you would never just like build a sheep farm, you know. Blue Byte have designed the game to largely prevent you from profiting off of the component materials, so you probably won't have the extra workforce to make them even if you wanted to, and it's really just not a moneymaker besides. And the only thing that's really worth anything is the finished product, and even there you're mostly just crafting for domestic use and recouping some costs occasionally on excess. If any advanced players are watching, you can let me know if you disagree with that, but that's just the way I see it. So anyway, 1-to-1 is simple enough, right? Let's look at the chain for bricks, which on the surface looks like the last one. Okay, so you're looking at this and you're saying, oh, this is easy. I dig up clay and send it to the factory and get bricks. And this is true, but if you look more closely, what you notice is that the production cycle on the clay pit is 30 seconds, and the production cycle on the brick factory is 60 seconds or minutes. So it can be helpful to think of production in terms of tons per minute. You can dig 2 tons of clay in a minute, but you can only process 1 ton of clay in that time with a single brick factory. So since we established it's always 1 in and 1 out, that leaves you with an extra ton of clay per minute. So you have a few options here. Obviously, you can build 2 brick factories, which you probably should for every clay pit, depending upon how much you need the bricks. And alternatively, you can actually run your clay pit at a negative efficiency of 50% if you wanted to, which would up the production cycle to a minute and just kind of synchronize them. That makes the workers a little happier, so I'm mentioning it, but normally I probably wouldn't bother. And finally, you can really just run a single brick factory if you want and sell the superfluous clay that you produce. Moving on, let's look at something a little more complex like beer. Okay, this one is all over the place because you've got the brewery and the grain farms outputting every 60 seconds, right? And then you've got hops producing every 90 seconds, and you've got the malt house producing every 30 seconds. If you hate math, you're probably breaking out into hives right now, though I gotta say, if you hate math, you probably wouldn't be playing this game in the first place. So, in a nutshell, they configured this chain to provide maximum efficiency in multiples of 2, which is to say 2 beer per minute, 4 beer, etc. The way I like to think about it is I figure the least common multiple of the production cycles, so in this case 180 seconds, or 3 minutes. And since the malt house can produce 6 tons of malt in that time, you can probably assume that 6 is the magic number with beer, since malt is a direct component to the final product. So then it's just a matter of making the ends meet, right? So 3 hops fields produce 6 tons of hops every 3 minutes, and 2 breweries produce 6 tons of beer. It all makes sense, right? The last thing I'll mention is that sometimes production chains make a little more sense when you consider the larger resource web. So real fast, we can see a good example of that with iron. Okay, so each ton of iron, and note that that's on a 15-second cycle, can be baked into 1 ton of steel by a furnace. These are on 30-second cycles. And then you've got steel beams, however, which get churned out every 45 seconds. So what is this madness? Your initial thought might be, okay, I need 2 furnaces to process the raw iron and make 2 steel every 30 seconds, and the steelworks runs 2 cycles every 90 seconds, so I need 3 steelworks to process 6 steel every 90 seconds, and you'll drive yourself crazy with this. And for the record, I mean, you can look up these production cycles online, and that'll help you out a little bit, but even though everything I just said is true, and you can do this, when you consider the bigger picture, you might notice that the weapons factory has a production cycle of 90 seconds. So, in other words, the steelworks uses 1 1/3 steel per minute, and the weapons factory uses 2/3 per minute. So together they're using 2 tons per minute, right? Which is the output of a single furnace. And if you are only running the 1 furnace, then also keep in mind that the iron mine is producing on a quicker cycle, so you've got half of the output of the mine still going into storage. And with that in mind, consider that once you get artisans, you're going to need to provide canned food for them, and the cannery uses unrefined iron to produce the canned food. So, long story short, if you only look at a single production chain, I think it can be a little bit misleading. Ultimately, this is a really large topic, and Blue Byte have crafted things so that you basically can't just overproduce like crazy, which might be your instinct. At least early on in the game, that's a real good way to go bankrupt real fast. In my experience, maybe not yours. Anyway, that concludes this extremely long basic lesson. Thoughts, criticisms, suggestions, you know where those go. I am super appreciative of any feedback you might want to offer, and for your information, a single like will always make my day. All that said, as usual, go forth, conquer, keep it casual, and play smarter.